Hello, and welcome to tonight's sleep story. Relax as I sit here by the fireplace and take you through the entire history of the British Empire, from its earliest days as a small island kingdom to its rise as the largest empire the world has ever known, spanning continents and shaping global history, and finally to its gradual decline and the creation of the Commonwealth. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could take a moment to comment where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you there. I always find it so special to see where everyone is joining from. Now put your phone on, do not disturb. Maybe open a window to let in a cool breeze, or turn on a fan for that soft, calming background hum. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Allow your body to sink deeper into relaxation. There's nothing you need to do right now. Just listen, unwind, and drift away as we travel back in time. Our journey begins in the distant past, long before the idea of empire, when the islands we now call Britain were a land of dense forests, wide rivers, and small scattered communities. Around 800,000 years ago, early human ancestors set foot on these islands. Over millennia, waves of people came and went, following animals and searching for shelter. During the Ice Ages, vast sheets of ice covered much of the land, forcing its inhabitants to retreat south or adapt to the harsh frozen landscape. As the climate warmed and the ice retreated, life flourished once more. Forests of oak, birch, and pine stretched across the land, and rivers teemed with fish and birds. By around 6000 BC, rising sea levels from melting glaciers finally cut Britain off from mainland Europe, creating the islands we know today. People living here became more isolated, developing their own customs, tools, and beliefs. In these early Neolithic times, communities built great stone monuments as places of worship, burial, or gathering. The most famous of these is Stonehenge, erected over many centuries between roughly 3000 BC and 2000 BC. Even now, its purpose remains partly a mystery. Some believe it was a temple to the sun, aligned with the solstices, while others see it as a burial site or a place of healing. Imagine the people who gathered there under the cold morning skies, watching the first light of dawn pierce through the great stones. As centuries passed, Bronze Age cultures emerged. They learned to craft tools and weapons from metal, giving them an advantage in hunting, farming, and later, conflict. Hill forts rose across the land, wooden palisades crowning hilltops to protect small settlements. By around 800 BC, the Iron Age had begun, and with it came the Celtic tribes. These Celtic peoples were not a single nation, but many tribes sharing similar languages, beliefs, and ways of life. They lived in roundhouses with thatched roofs, surrounded by wooden fences and stone walls. They farmed wheat and barley, raised cattle and sheep, and traded goods made of iron, bronze, and pottery. Druids held important positions as priests, judges, and teachers, guiding spiritual life and preserving oral traditions. The Celts believed in many gods linked to nature. Forests, rivers, and skies were alive with spirits and divine power. Then, in 55 BC, everything began to change with the arrival of Julius Caesar and his Roman legions. Though Caesar's first invasion was brief and largely exploratory, it marked the beginning of Rome's interest in these islands at the edge of their known world. Nearly a century later, in 43 AD, Emperor Claudius ordered a full-scale invasion. The Roman conquest of Britain had begun. For almost 400 years, Britain became part of the vast Roman Empire. The Romans built towns with stone buildings, baths, and forums. They laid straight roads that connected their settlements, some of which still shape the roads of Britain today. They built Hadrian's Wall to guard the northern frontier from the Picts of what is now Scotland, a mighty stone barrier stretching from coast to coast. Roman rule brought trade and new technologies, but it also brought taxes, military conscription, and foreign governors. Some native tribes resisted fiercely, One of the most famous was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. In 60 AD, after suffering great injustice from the Romans, she led a massive uprising, destroying Roman settlements including what is now London, before being defeated. Over time, Roman and native ways of life blended. People worshipped both Roman gods and local deities, lived in Roman-style villas, and spoke a mixture of Latin and Celtic languages. But by the early 5th century, Rome itself was weakening. Pressures from invasions back home forced the legions to withdraw from Britain, leaving the islanders to govern themselves once again. What followed was an era of migration and upheaval. Germanic tribes from across the North Sea, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began to settle. They established their own small kingdoms, bringing their languages, which over centuries would evolve into Old English. The native Celtic peoples retreated into Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, holding on to their traditions in those rugged lands. For centuries, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rose and fell, their kings battling each other for power. Christianity arrived with missionaries like Saint Augustine in the late 6th century, building monasteries and churches, teaching literacy and recording histories once only spoken. Then came the Vikings in the late 8th century, fierce warriors and traders from Scandinavia, who raided monasteries and towns along the coasts. Over time, many settled and integrated, particularly in the north and east of England, in areas known as the Danelaw. Finally, in 1066, came a moment that changed British history forever: the Norman conquest. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne and invaded with his army, defeating King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror became the first Norman king of England. Under his rule and his successors, castles rose across the land, built in stone to assert power and keep the new kingdom secure. French became the language of the court and nobility, blending with Old English to form Middle English over the coming centuries. Feudalism structured society under the king, with lords, knights, and peasants, each holding their place in the grand hierarchy. These early centuries laid the foundations for what would become England, and later Britain, a land shaped by invasion and migration, conquest and culture, faith and tradition, a place ready in time to look outwards beyond its shores, and to build an empire that would touch every corner of the world. As the medieval centuries passed, the kingdoms of England and later Britain continued to grow in power, wealth, and ambition. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, England entered an era of strong, centralized rule under Norman and Plantagenet kings. The Plantagenet dynasty ruled from the mid-12th century to the late 15th century, a time marked by war, politics, and gradual cultural change. One of the earliest Plantagenet kings was Henry II, who reigned from 1154 to 1189. Henry expanded royal control over his territories, not only in England, but also across large parts of France, creating what historians call the Angevin Empire. Though it was not an empire in the overseas sense, it showed England's kings ruling lands beyond their island, foreshadowing later ambitions. During this period, disputes between kings and the powerful English barons often arose. One such conflict led to the creation of the Magna Carta in 1215 under King John. This Great Charter limited royal authority, ensuring certain rights and protections for the nobility. Over time, it became a foundation for English law and governance, echoing through centuries as a symbol of liberty. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, England's kings sought to extend their influence into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Edward I, known as Hammer of the Scots, conquered Wales in the late 13th century, building great stone castles like Carnarvon and Conwy to secure his rule. His attempts to conquer Scotland were less successful, meeting fierce resistance from leaders such as William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the Anglo-Norman lords gradually established control over parts of the island, following an invasion in the late 12th century, though their dominance was often challenged by Gaelic chiefs. The late medieval period also saw England embroiled in long conflicts on the continent. The Hundred Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453, was driven by rival claims to the French throne and territorial disputes. It was during this war that the English achieved famous victories, such as the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, under King Henry V, where heavily outnumbered English archers defeated a much larger French force. However, by the end of the war, England had lost nearly all its lands in France except for Calais, which itself would fall in 1558. The war left England financially strained and weakened, paving the way for internal strife. Following this came the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between two branches of the royal Plantagenet family, the houses of Lancaster and York, fighting for the English throne. These conflicts lasted from 1455 to 1487, ending when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and was crowned Henry VII. Henry VII founded the Tudor dynasty, which ushered in a new era. His reign stabilized the kingdom after decades of turmoil, rebuilt royal finances, and laid the groundwork for a powerful monarchy. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son, Henry VIII, became king. Henry VIII is remembered for many things: his 6 wives, his break with the Roman Catholic Church, and his creation of the Church of England when the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This act of reformation changed English religion and politics forever. Under Henry VIII, England strengthened its navy, building ships and developing maritime skills that would later prove crucial in overseas expansion. His daughter, Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, inherited these changes and became one of England's most celebrated monarchs. Elizabeth's reign, known as the Elizabethan era, was a golden age of culture, exploration, and national pride. Writers like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and poets like Edmund Spenser flourished, creating works that still echo today. At the same time, English sailors and explorers began to venture further into the world's oceans. Men like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, while Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to establish colonies in the Americas. Privateers, sailors, licensed to raid enemy ships, attacked Spanish treasure fleets returning from the New World, bringing immense wealth back to England. One of the greatest threats to Elizabeth's reign came from Spain, the most powerful empire of the age. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain sent the Great Armada to invade England and overthrow Elizabeth. But English naval tactics, fierce storms, and Spanish miscalculations led to the Armada's defeat. This victory boosted England's confidence and maritime reputation, sowing the seeds of future imperial ambitions. Despite these early expeditions, England still lagged behind Spain and Portugal, who dominated global exploration and colonization in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Spanish controlled vast territories in the Americas, rich with gold and silver, while the Portuguese commanded lucrative trade routes around Africa to India and beyond. However, England was learning. Merchants and investors formed companies to fund overseas ventures. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the East India Company, giving it the right to trade with the East Indies. Though it began as a trading company, over the coming centuries, it would become a powerful force of empire, controlling vast territories in India and shaping global trade. Elizabeth's death in 1603 marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. Her cousin James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Under the Stuarts, England faced political and religious turmoil, including the English Civil War, the execution of King Charles I, and the brief rule of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, England continued its imperial projects with renewed vigour. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed much of the old medieval city, but from its ashes rose a rebuilt capital, a symbol of resilience and progress. The late 17th century saw England consolidate its naval power and expand its colonial ambitions. Conflicts with the Dutch led to wars over trade and sea routes, while in 1707, the Act of Union united England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. This new Britain stood poised to expand beyond Europe, driven by its growing navy, its merchants, and its thirst for trade, resources, and influence. These centuries of monarchy, conquest, religious upheaval, and exploration laid the foundations for what would soon become the British Empire, an empire that would reach across the world, changing lands and peoples far beyond its cold northern shores. As we continue our journey through the history of the British Empire, we enter a time when sails rose against the horizon, and wooden ships carried men and dreams across vast oceans. The Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery, spanned roughly from the 15th to the 17th centuries. It began with Portugal and Spain, whose explorers charted new sea routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Yet by the late 16th century, England too began to look outward with ambition. The earliest English attempts at overseas colonization were driven by a mixture of trade, adventure, and the hope for riches like those found by Spain. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, reached the coast of North America, possibly Newfoundland. Though little came from his voyage at the time, it marked the first English claim in the New World. Over the next century, English interest in North America grew slowly. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh established the first English colony at Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. But when supply ships returned in 1590, they found the settlement abandoned, with only the mysterious word Croatoan carved into a tree. The fate of the so-called lost colony remains unknown to this day. Despite these early failures, English merchants and investors remained determined. In 1606, King James I granted a charter to the Virginia Company, allowing them to establish settlements in North America. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in the New World. Life in Jamestown was harsh. Disease, starvation, and conflict with local Powhatan peoples nearly wiped out the settlers. But over time, with the introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe, the colony began to prosper. Tobacco became a valuable export to Europe, and more settlers arrived, seeking fortune or a new life. Throughout the 17th century, English colonies spread along the Atlantic coast. Plymouth Colony was founded in 1620 by the Pilgrims, a group of English separatists seeking religious freedom. They crossed the ocean aboard the Mayflower, landing in what is now Massachusetts. Their story became enshrined in American history, remembered each year at Thanksgiving. Other colonies followed: Massachusetts Bay, Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and more. Each had its own character, some founded for profit, others for religious refuge. They grew slowly at first, with settlers carving out farms, building wooden houses, and forming small towns. They lived in close communities, attending church, trading goods, and often clashing with indigenous peoples whose lands they now claimed. Further south, England captured colonies from rival European powers. In 1664, the English seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York after the Duke of York. The city, with its excellent natural harbour, would grow into one of the greatest in the world. Meanwhile, English interest in the Caribbean intensified. Sugar became the gold of the Caribbean, and colonies like Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands were established to produce it. The sugar plantations were vast and profitable, but their wealth was built upon the brutal system of African slavery. Starting in the 17th century, England became heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade. Ships carried manufactured goods to West Africa, exchanged them for enslaved men, women, and children, transported them across the ocean in horrific conditions to the Caribbean and Americas, and then returned to England with sugar, tobacco, and other products. This became known as the triangular trade. Millions of Africans were enslaved, torn from their homes and families, forced to work under appalling conditions. The wealth of the British Empire grew on their suffering, a dark chapter that remains part of its legacy. While North America and the Caribbean grew as English colonial centers, another region beckoned with promises of wealth: the East. As early as 1600, Queen Elizabeth I had granted a royal charter to the East India Company, giving it exclusive rights to trade with the East Indies. Its first voyages sought spices and textiles in Southeast Asia, but it soon found greater opportunity in India. At first, the East India Company established trading posts along the Indian coast, in places like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They traded cotton, silk, indigo dye, tea, and spices, weaving themselves into the complex networks of Indian commerce. Over time, the company built forts to protect its warehouses, employed soldiers, and even minted its own coins. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the company grew in power, acting almost as a state within a state. It negotiated with Indian rulers, fought rival European trading powers like the French, and raised private armies. Its influence would only expand in the centuries to come. Beyond India, English explorers sailed to other corners of the world. In the early 17th century, Henry Hudson sought a northwest passage to Asia, exploring the river that now bears his name in New York. Later, Captain James Cook undertook his great voyages in the Pacific in the 18th century, charting New Zealand and Australia, and claiming the eastern coast of Australia for Britain in 1770. This land would become the colony of New South Wales, and later the nation of Australia. Meanwhile, in Africa, English merchants established small trading forts along the coast. These were not yet colonies in the modern sense, but they served as bases for trade in gold, ivory, and enslaved people. The Royal African Company, founded in 1672, held a monopoly on English trade with West Africa, becoming heavily involved in the slave trade. At home, the growing colonies enriched Britain. Ships brought back sugar, rum, tobacco, cotton, and exotic goods. Merchants grew wealthy, port cities like Bristol and Liverpool expanded rapidly, and the foundations were laid for Britain's future industrial revolution. The empire's expansion fueled economic growth, though often at great human cost to those enslaved or colonized. As the 17th century turned into the 18th, Britain was emerging as a major global power. Its navy grew stronger, protecting merchant shipping and asserting dominance over rival European fleets. The Royal Navy became the shield and spear of empire, guarding trade routes and projecting British power across oceans. The age of exploration was thus not only about discovery. For Britain, it was the beginning of an age of commerce, colonization, and conflict. From small trading posts and struggling settlements grew powerful colonies that would form the backbone of an empire. These early centuries of exploration and colonization set the stage for what was to come. Britain's gaze turned ever outward, driven by merchants seeking profit, governments seeking influence, and missionaries seeking to spread their faith. As you rest here tonight, imagine the creaking of wooden ships upon dark waves, the sails billowing with ocean winds, and the quiet hum of sailors speaking in the dim lantern light. Picture the settlements rising on distant shores, forts of timber and stone, marketplaces of spices and silks, and the slow shaping of an empire that would, in time, claim dominion over a quarter of the world's land and people. As the 18th century began, Britain stood on the edge of becoming a global empire. Its rulers, merchants, and navy were ready to expand their reach across the world. The century opened under the rule of the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne. Her reign or the passing of the Act of Union in 1707, uniting England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. This union created a stronger political entity, combining the resources, manpower, and ambitions of both nations under a single crown. One of the first major conflicts of the century was the War of the Spanish Succession, lasting from 1701 to 1714. The death of the childless Spanish king triggered a battle over who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. Britain allied with the Dutch Republic and Austria against France and Spain, aiming to prevent a single dominant European power. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, which granted Britain several valuable territories, including Gibraltar and Minorca. Gibraltar, at the entrance to the Mediterranean, became a key naval base, enabling Britain to control important trade routes. After Queen Anne's death in 1714, the crown passed to the Hanoverians. George I, originally from Germany, spoke little English and left much of the governing to his ministers. This shift allowed Parliament to gain greater influence over the monarchy, leading to the rise of figures like Robert Walpole, regarded as Britain's first Prime Minister, who held power from 1721 to 1742. Britain's global trade expanded rapidly during this time. Merchant ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, traded them for enslaved people, transported them across the Atlantic to plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, and then returned with sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This triangular trade system brought immense wealth to British merchants, ports like Liverpool and Bristol, and the royal treasury. However, it was built upon unimaginable human suffering, as millions of Africans were enslaved, transported in horrific conditions, and forced to work under brutal regimes. The mid-century saw the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739, named after an incident where Spanish coast guards allegedly cut off the ear of British Captain Robert Jenkins. Though the cause was dramatic, the war reflected deeper commercial rivalries between Britain and Spain over Caribbean trade. This conflict merged into the War of Austrian Succession, lasting until 1748, with Britain fighting alongside Austria against France and Spain. However, it was the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, that truly transformed Britain into a global imperial power. This was the first conflict fought on a worldwide scale, with battles in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. In North America, it is known as the French and Indian War, as British and French forces, allied with different indigenous nations, fought for control of the continent. Under commanders like General James Wolfe, the British captured Quebec in 1759, effectively ending French colonial power in Canada. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the war, granting Britain control over Canada, Florida from Spain, and dominance in India, where the British East India Company had defeated the French-supported forces at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This victory under Robert Clive marked the beginning of British political control in India, transforming the East India Company from a trading corporation into a territorial power. Despite these victories, the 7 Years' War left Britain with a massive national debt. To repay it, Parliament introduced new taxes on its American colonies, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. These were met with fierce opposition from colonists who argued they should not be taxed without representation in Parliament. Protests, boycotts, and escalating tensions followed, culminating in events like the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. In 1775, the American Revolutionary War began. British forces won early victories, but struggled to control the vast colonies against determined American rebels, supported by France and Spain. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the independence of the United States of America, marking the loss of Britain's most populous overseas colonies. This loss forced Britain to reorient its imperial ambitions. Attention shifted towards Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The East India Company continued to expand its control in India, administering entire regions, collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and acting as a state within a state. By the late 18th century, it governed millions of people and dominated trade in cotton, silk, indigo dye, saltpeter, and tea. Elsewhere, Britain sought new lands for penal transportation. With American colonies no longer an option, the British government turned to Australia. In 1788, the first fleet of 11 ships carrying convicts, soldiers, and officials arrived at Botany Bay, establishing the colony of New South Wales. Over the following decades, settlements expanded along the Australian coast, displacing Aboriginal peoples who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. In Africa, British interests remained primarily coastal, with trading forts along the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. While these outposts were focused on trade, especially in enslaved people, gold, and ivory, they formed the basis for deeper colonial penetration in the 19th century. In the Caribbean, sugar remained the dominant export, generating enormous wealth. Plantations depended entirely on enslaved African labor. Conditions were harsh, mortality rates were high, and resistance was constant. By the late 18th century, public opposition to slavery grew in Britain. Abolitionist figures like William Wilberforce campaigned for its end, while accounts from formerly enslaved people, such as Olaudah Equiano, revealed the horrors of the trade to the public. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain's economy and society. Beginning in the mid-18th century, new technologies like the spinning jenny, water frame, and steam engine revolutionized textile production and manufacturing. Urbanization accelerated as people moved from rural areas to towns in search of factory work. Iron production and coal mining expanded, fueling industries and railways. This industrial growth increased Britain's demand for raw materials and markets abroad, intertwining empire with economic progress. At sea, Britain's naval power continued to grow. The Royal Navy protected trade routes, enforced imperial policies, and defeated rivals. Naval dominance allowed Britain to control distant colonies and ensured that goods flowed back to its ports. Politically, Britain became more stable compared to its European neighbours. The French Revolution of 1789 and the rise of Napoleon in the following decade plunged Europe into turmoil, but Britain maintained its parliamentary monarchy and used its economic and naval power to fight against Napoleonic France. By the end of the 18th century, Britain had transformed from a collection of kingdoms into a unified state with global influence. Its empire included colonies in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and the Pacific. Trade networks spanned the globe, and its navy controlled the seas. This expansion, however, came with deep contradictions. The wealth of merchants, industrialists, and the crown was built on colonization, exploitation, and slavery. Indigenous peoples lost lands, cultures, and lives. Enslaved Africans were treated as property, while factory workers at home labored long hours for meager wages. Yet in the eyes of Britain's ruling classes, the empire represented progress, civilization, and power. This belief would drive them into the next century, an age when Britain would become the undisputed global hegemon under Queen Victoria, ruling over territories that spanned nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface and controlling the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The foundations laid in the 18th century through war, trade, colonization, and industrialization set the stage for this imperial peak. As Britain moved into the 19th century, it was poised to create an empire upon which, they said, the sun would never set. As Britain entered the 19th century, it stood poised to become the greatest empire in history. The Industrial Revolution transformed its economy, society, and military capabilities, enabling expansion on a scale never before seen. At the dawn of the century, Britain was at war with revolutionary France. The French Revolution of 1789 had overthrown the monarchy and plunged Europe into turmoil. Britain joined other European powers in a series of coalitions against France. This period saw the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies swept across Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, from 1803 to 1815, were fought on land and sea. Britain's Royal Navy secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 under Admiral Lord Nelson, ensuring British naval supremacy for the next century. On land, British forces under the Duke of Wellington played a crucial role in defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. These wars strengthened Britain's global position. French colonial ambitions were curbed, and Britain gained control of strategic territories, including Malta, Mauritius, Trinidad, and the Cape Colony in South Africa. The 19th century was marked by the reign of Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne in 1837 and ruled until 1901. Her reign became synonymous with Britain's imperial peak. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," reflected its vast reach, stretching across every continent and time zone. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, matured in the 19th century. New technologies like steam engines, railways, and telegraphs revolutionized transport and communication. British factories produced textiles, iron, and manufactured goods at an unprecedented scale, requiring raw materials from abroad and creating markets for exports. India remained central to British imperial interests. After the decline of the Mughal Empire, the British East India Company expanded its control through treaties, annexations, and wars. In 1857, the Indian Rebellion broke out, sparked by resentment against company rule, cultural impositions, and economic exploitation. Though it was suppressed, the uprising led to significant changes. In 1858, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India, establishing the British Raj. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1877. India became the jewel of the British Empire, providing cotton, tea, indigo, and later opium, which Britain traded to China in exchange for tea. In China, Britain sought greater trade access. When Chinese authorities attempted to suppress the opium trade, Britain launched the First Opium War in 1839. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, forcing China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open ports to British merchants. A second conflict, the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, resulted in further concessions, expanding British influence in East Asia. In Africa, the 19th century saw the beginning of deeper colonial expansion. The Cape Colony in South Africa, seized from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, became a key strategic point for ships traveling to India. British settlers arrived, leading to tensions with the indigenous Xhosa and Zulu peoples, as well as with the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers. The scramble for Africa intensified in the late 19th century. European powers divided the continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, formalizing claims and boundaries without any African input. Britain expanded its territories in West Africa, including Nigeria and the Gold Coast, and in East Africa, establishing Kenya and Uganda as protectorates. In southern Africa, Britain fought two Boer wars against the independent Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, eventually annexing them into the empire. In Egypt, Britain gained control of the Suez Canal in 1882. The canal, opened in 1869, was a vital shortcut between Europe and Asia, reducing travel time to India significantly. Control of the canal became a cornerstone of British imperial strategy. Meanwhile, in Australasia, the colonies of Australia and New Zealand grew rapidly. Australia transformed from a penal colony into a collection of prosperous settlements exporting wool and gold. By 1901, Australia became a federated dominion within the British Empire. In New Zealand, British settlers signed the Treaty of Waitangi with Maori chiefs in 1840, establishing British sovereignty. Conflicts followed as settlers expanded into Maori lands. In Canada, following the American Revolution, British loyalists settled in large numbers, strengthening colonial ties. In 1867, Canada became the first dominion of the British Empire, gaining self-government while remaining under the British Crown. The Caribbean colonies continued to produce sugar, though the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833 transformed plantation economies. Freed African populations created their own communities, churches, and cultural identities, despite continued economic hardship under colonial systems. The Victorian era also saw the rise of imperial ideology. Writers, politicians, and educators promoted the idea of the British Empire as a civilizing force, bringing progress and modernity to the world. This ideology justified conquest and rule, masking the realities of exploitation, economic extraction, and cultural suppression. Missionary movements expanded alongside imperial conquest. Churches sent missionaries to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to spread Christianity, often working with colonial administrations and introducing Western education, medicine, and cultural norms. While they provided schools and hospitals, they also undermined local beliefs and traditions, contributing to cultural erosion. Technological advances reinforced imperial power. Steamships reduced travel time, railways facilitated resource extraction, and the telegraph connected Britain with its colonies, enabling near-instant communication across vast distances. The completion of the first underwater telegraph cable from Britain to India in 1870 symbolized this new age of global connectivity. In the late 19th century, British imperial expansion reached its peak. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was celebrated as a festival of empire, with representatives from across the colonies parading in London. The empire included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, vast territories in Africa, islands in the Caribbean and Pacific, and numerous trading posts and protectorates. Yet beneath this grandeur lay tensions and contradictions. Resistance to British rule grew in many colonies. In India, movements for self-rule gained strength, led by figures like Dadabhai Nauroji and later Mahatma Gandhi. In Africa, rebellions broke out against colonial policies, taxes, and land seizures. In Ireland, demands for home rule intensified, challenging Britain's control closer to home. At the same time, the empire faced competition from other European powers, particularly Germany, which emerged as an industrial and military rival. The geopolitical landscape was shifting towards the conflicts that would engulf the world in the 20th century. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, Britain ruled over a quarter of the world's land and people. The empire was held together by naval supremacy, economic dominance, and imperial ideology, but it faced growing strains from within and without. The 19th century had transformed Britain from an industrializing European state into a global imperial power. The Victorian Empire was marked by expansion, technological innovation, and cultural self-confidence, but also by oppression, economic exploitation, and racial hierarchies that would leave lasting legacies across the world. This was the age when Britain truly became the world's hegemon, shaping global trade, politics, and culture, while sowing the seeds of the independence movements and conflicts that would emerge in the century to come. As the 20th century began, Britain's empire stood at its greatest extent. It ruled over a quarter of the world's land and people, and London was the financial capital of the global economy. But the new century brought challenges that would test and ultimately end Britain's imperial dominance. The first major upheaval was the First World War. In 1914, tensions between European powers erupted into war after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Britain entered the war against Germany and its allies after Germany invaded Belgium, violating its neutrality. Britain's vast empire provided troops, resources, and supplies. Soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Caribbean fought on battlefields in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The war was devastating. Trench warfare on the Western Front led to millions of casualties. Battles like the Somme, Passchendaele, and Ypres became symbols of industrialized slaughter. At sea, the Royal Navy blockaded Germany, while German U-boats attacked British shipping. In the Middle East, British forces fought the Ottoman Empire, capturing Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus, with the support of Arab revolts led by figures like T.E. Lawrence. The war ended in 1918 with Allied victory. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany, redrew borders in Europe, and dissolved the Ottoman Empire. Britain gained new territories under League of Nations mandates, including Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, expanding its Middle Eastern presence. Yet the war came at enormous cost. Over 700,000 British soldiers died, with many more wounded. The empire's finances were strained, and public confidence in imperial grandeur was shaken. Nationalist movements in colonies grew stronger, inspired by the sacrifices their people had made, and by President Wilson's promises of self-determination. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 had been brutally suppressed, but it ignited the struggle for independence. In 1921, after years of conflict, the Anglo-Irish Treaty established the Irish Free State, effectively ending British rule in most of Ireland, while retaining Northern Ireland under British control. The interwar years were marked by both hope and anxiety. The empire continued to expand economically, with Britain trading manufactured goods for colonial raw materials. Cultural links were strengthened through the idea of the British Commonwealth, fostering loyalty to the crown. However, the global economy was fragile. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought mass unemployment and hardship, weakening imperial confidence further. In India, the independence movement grew under Mahatma Gandhi, who led non-violent protests against British rule. The Salt March of 1930 and subsequent campaigns challenged Britain's moral legitimacy to govern. Then, in 1939, war came again. The Second World War began when Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The British Empire once more mobilized its vast resources. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean joined the fight against the Axis powers. In 1940, after France fell, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain saw the Royal Air Force repel German attempts to gain air superiority, preventing invasion. Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, inspired resistance with his speeches and determination to fight on. The war expanded to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. In 1941, Japan attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia, capturing Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. The fall of Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress, shocked the empire and exposed its vulnerabilities in Asia. Gradually, with American and Soviet support, the Allies turned the tide. In 1944, D-Day saw Allied forces land in Normandy, opening a Western front against Germany. By May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Second World War left Britain victorious but exhausted. Its economy was deeply in debt, its cities damaged by bombing, and its people weary after 6 years of total war. The empire's days were numbered. Independence movements accelerated. In India, the Quit India movement of 1942 and growing unrest made continued colonial rule untenable. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, ending nearly 2 centuries of rule. The partition led to mass migrations and communal violence as millions crossed borders to join their chosen nation. Elsewhere, decolonisation gathered pace. In the Middle East, Britain withdrew from Palestine in 1948, leading to the creation of Israel and subsequent regional conflicts. In Africa, nationalist leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya demanded independence. The 1950s and 1960s saw a wave of decolonisation. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957. Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and many others followed. In Southeast Asia, Burma, Myanmar, gained independence in 1948, Malaya in 1957, and Singapore in 1965 after a brief union with Malaysia. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a turning point. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention. International pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union forced Britain to withdraw, humiliating the government and signaling the end of its status as a global superpower. Throughout the post-war years, Britain redefined its relationship with former colonies through the Commonwealth of Nations, an association of independent countries acknowledging shared history and, in some cases, the British monarch as head of state. In the Caribbean, colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados gained independence in the 1960s. In the Pacific, Fiji, Samoa, and others followed suit. In Africa, Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 after years of conflict, while South Africa remained outside the Commonwealth during its apartheid era, rejoining after democratic reforms in the 1990s. Hong Kong, Britain's last major colony, was handed over to China in 1997 under a unique agreement preserving its economic and legal systems for 50 years. By the end of the 20th century, the British Empire had transformed into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of over 50 countries, many of which maintain economic and cultural ties to Britain. The Empire's legacy is complex. It spread the English language, legal systems, and cultural influences worldwide, but it also left deep wounds through exploitation, violence, and racial hierarchies. The World Wars exposed the limitations of imperial power. Britain relied heavily on its colonies for manpower and resources, yet the wars also empowered nationalist movements, highlighted racial inequalities, and eroded the moral authority of imperial rule. At home, post-war Britain transformed into a multicultural society as people from former colonies migrated to rebuild the country's economy and seek new lives. Cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester became hubs of diverse cultures, reflecting the global connections forged by empire. The decline of the empire reshaped global power dynamics. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, while Britain adjusted to its new role as a medium-sized nation, within alliances like NATO and organizations like the European Union. Though the formal empire ended, its influences continue today. Former colonies grapple with legacies of colonial borders, economic systems, and social divisions. Britain itself debates its identity, caught between its imperial past and its present place in a globalized world. The story of the British Empire, from its rise to its decline, is a story of ambition and conquest, trade and exploitation, innovation and oppression. It shaped the modern world in profound ways, leaving a legacy that is studied, debated, and felt in every continent it once touched. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire that once spanned the globe was steadily transforming into something new. The process of decolonisation, which began in earnest after the Second World War, unfolded across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, reshaping the map and the relationships between Britain and its former colonies. After India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947, the pace of decolonisation accelerated. In Asia, Burma became independent in 1948. Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, gained independence the same year. Malaya followed in 1957, later joining with North Borneo, Sarawak, and Singapore to form Malaysia, though Singapore would eventually become fully independent in 1965. In Africa, nationalist leaders mobilized people through political parties, trade unions, and movements that challenged colonial rule. Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957. Its example inspired other territories across the continent. Nigeria, the most populous British colony in Africa, gained independence in 1960. Kenya's struggle for freedom, marked by the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, led to independence in 1963 under Jomo Kenyatta. East African colonies such as Tanzania and Uganda gained independence soon after, while Zambia, Malawi, and Botswana joined the wave of newly sovereign nations in the 1960s. Southern Africa posed different challenges. In Rhodesia, white minority settlers declared unilateral independence in 1965, leading to a prolonged conflict that only ended in 1980 with the creation of Zimbabwe. In the Caribbean, decolonisation came in stages. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became independent in 1962. Barbados followed in 1966. Other island nations gained sovereignty over the following decades, though many retained constitutional ties to Britain through the monarchy or as members of the Commonwealth. In the Pacific, small island territories such as Fiji, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands transitioned to independence in the 1970s and 1980s, often maintaining close cultural and economic ties with Britain. Throughout this process, the nature of Britain's relationship with its former colonies shifted. The British Commonwealth, first established in the early 20th century to acknowledge dominions like Canada and Australia, evolved into the modern Commonwealth of Nations. Membership is voluntary and includes countries that were never formal colonies, such as Mozambique and Rwanda. The Commonwealth is not an empire, but rather an association that promotes cooperation, development, and shared values. It provides a forum for member states to discuss trade, governance, human rights, and cultural exchange. For some, it remains a symbol of connection and shared history. For others, it is a reminder of an imperial past that still shapes social and economic realities. One of the final symbols of Britain's imperial retreat came with the handover of Hong Kong. Acquired in stages through treaties in the 19th century, Hong Kong developed into one of the world's leading financial centres under British rule. In 1997, Britain transferred sovereignty over Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China, under the principle of one country, two systems, an arrangement meant to preserve Hong Kong's economic and legal autonomy for 50 years. At home, the end of empire brought lasting change. Waves of migration from former colonies reshaped British society. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived in Britain to help rebuild the post-war economy, work in factories, staff hospitals, and contribute to industries across the country. Cities such as London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leicester became home to vibrant, multicultural communities. These communities faced challenges from discrimination and inequality to cultural clashes, but over time, they helped transform Britain into a diverse, globalized society. Music, food, fashion, and language all bear the imprint of these migrations. The legacy of empire remains visible not only in statues and museums, but in the everyday life of modern Britain. In politics and public debate, Britain's imperial past continues to provoke discussion and reflection. Some remember it with nostalgia for lost power and global influence. Others point to the violence, exploitation, and injustices that accompanied colonization. Debates over how to teach imperial history in schools, how to address the legacies of slavery and colonization, and how to reckon with symbols of empire, from statues to street names, a part of an ongoing national conversation. The Commonwealth remains an active network, holding regular meetings and events like the Commonwealth Games. For many smaller member states, it provides diplomatic and economic support, while for Britain, it maintains a link to a global role despite its reduced status in world affairs. Today, the British monarch remains the symbolic head of the Commonwealth, a position separate from the constitutional role as monarch of the United Kingdom. Some Commonwealth nations, such as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, continue to recognise the British monarch as their head of state, while others have become republics within the association. Economically, the legacy of empire is evident in global trade patterns, legal systems, and institutions that were shaped by British influence. English remains a global language of business, diplomacy, and culture, an inheritance of centuries of imperial reach. Former colonies navigate this legacy in diverse ways. Some have prospered, developing vibrant economies and strong democratic institutions. Others continue to grapple with poverty, political instability, and social divisions rooted in colonial borders and economic structures. For Britain itself, the legacy of empire is complex. It brought wealth and global power, but also tied the country to the injustices of the slave trade, land dispossession, and cultural erasure. The empire's infrastructure, its railways, ports, and telegraph lines, reshaped regions, but often served the interests of Britain's economy more than local development. In recent decades, calls for reparations, apologies, and the return of cultural artifacts have gained momentum. Museums across Britain display objects collected during imperial expansion, from the Benin bronzes to the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and debates continue over whether these should remain in British institutions or be returned to their countries of origin. At the same time, Britain's global connections have left enduring ties. Families, languages, and traditions cross borders that once were lines drawn on imperial maps. Diaspora communities maintain cultural links with ancestral homelands, blending identities shaped by migration, memory, and modern life. From its origins as an island kingdom on the edge of Europe to its rise as the largest empire the world has known, Britain's imperial story is a story of ambition, power, and contradiction. The end of empire did not erase its impact. Instead, it transformed it into new relationships of independence and interdependence, sovereignty and connection. What began with exploration and trade ended in decolonisation and the creation of a global community bound by history, language, and complex ties that endure long after the formal empire faded. The story of the British Empire is one of vast contrasts, of power and vulnerability, ambition and consequence, creation and destruction. The empire was driven by many forces: the pursuit of trade, the search for resources, competition with European rivals, and a belief in Britain's right to rule. Its expansion was made possible by technological innovations: the sailing ships of the Age of Exploration, the steam engines of the Industrial Revolution, and the railways and telegraphs that tied distant colonies together. At its peak, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain governed over a quarter of the world's people and lands. From the bustling ports of Bombay and Singapore to the farmlands of Canada and Australia, from the Caribbean plantations to African protectorates and Middle Eastern mandates, British influence shaped economies, borders, languages, and cultures. The empire built railways, ports, and administrative systems that integrated colonies into global trade. It established schools and universities, spread legal and political frameworks based on its own institutions, and left English as a lingua franca that connects people across continents even today. Yet alongside these developments were deep costs. The expansion of empire brought dispossession, as indigenous lands were seized for settlement, plantations, and resource extraction. Colonial rule imposed taxes, laws, and systems that disrupted existing societies. resistance was often met with violence, and revolts were suppressed with military force. The slave trade, a central part of Britain's early imperial wealth, forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas and Caribbean, leaving a legacy of trauma and racial injustice that persists generations later. The plantations of the Caribbean and cotton mills of Britain were linked by these chains of human suffering. In India, British economic policies reoriented agriculture towards imperial needs, causing disruptions that contributed to famines and hardship. Cultural interventions undermined local traditions, even as Western education and legal systems created new social classes and aspirations. Throughout the empire, people resisted through armed rebellion, political movements, and cultural resilience. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and countless others challenged imperial rule, demanding independence and dignity for their peoples. The two world wars accelerated the decline of empire. Though Britain emerged victorious in both, the costs were immense. The empire's resources were stretched, its moral authority was weakened, and nationalist movements gained momentum, driven by a desire for self-rule after decades or centuries under foreign domination. Decolonisation transformed the world map. Former colonies became independent nations, each forging its own path while grappling with the borders, systems, and legacies left behind. The Commonwealth emerged as a new framework, an association that reflected historical ties, but with relationships grounded in equality and voluntary cooperation, rather than imperial rule. For Britain, the end of empire required redefinition. No longer the world's dominant power, it adapted to a role as a European nation with global connections, a member of alliances and organizations rather than an imperial ruler. The legacy of empire remains woven into British society through its multicultural communities, global trade relationships, and the cultural, political, and economic institutions shaped by imperial history. The empire's story is a reminder of the complexities of human ambition. It tells of discoveries and innovations, connections made across vast oceans, and the spread of ideas and languages. It also tells of exploitation, violence, and the assertion of power over others. Understanding this history means holding both truths at once. The British Empire built networks that continue to link people and nations today. At the same time, its injustices and disruptions left wounds that still shape lives, identities, and global realities. From a small kingdom on the edge of Europe to the most powerful empire in history, and finally to a nation connected to its former colonies through the Commonwealth, the story of Britain's empire is the story of transformation over centuries. And so we come to the end of this long journey through time. From ancient invasions and medieval kingdoms, to voyages of discovery, the heights of imperial ambition, and the emergence of new nations reclaiming their futures. It is a story that shaped the modern world in ways both visible and hidden, in ways still unfolding with each passing generation. I hope you enjoyed tonight's sleep story, exploring the entire history of the British Empire, from its earliest beginnings to its rise as the world's largest empire, and finally to its decline and transformation into the Commonwealth. If you're still awake, don't worry. Just let your mind rest and wander. And if you'd like, why not put on another of our videos to help you drift off even deeper tonight? You can find plenty more calming histories and sleep stories right here on the channel. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you a peaceful night's rest wherever you are in the world.